Welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Mick West. My guest today is Alex, who has a rather different journey into conspiracism than most people who usually get into it via watching a video later in life. Alex was actually raised by conspiracy theorists. His parents were conspiracy theorists, and so for him, being a conspiracy theorist was essentially his default position. He eventually emerged out of this after going to college, but one of the last things he held onto was his belief in the 9/11 conspiracy theory, 9/11 being an inside job. And one of the things that helped him out of that finally was reading my book, Escaping the Rabbit Hole. So that was very interesting to me, and we talk about that in the second half of this interview. Alex, welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you just emailed me kind of out of the blue and told me a bit about, where you're coming from and stuff.
Sure. So some of this has kind of like come to light for me more recently, after having gone to therapy for a couple of years and just reflecting on things. But I think in a lot of ways, I was like brought up in my upbringing, that kind of like laid the foundation for being receptive to this kind of thinking. It's kind of like a generalized distrust of reality. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's one of those things growing up when you're a kid, you don't notice it, you don't pay attention to it because it's normalized. You just want to believe your parents. And it's only kind of retrospectively that I realized, hey, my parents didn't have maybe normal ideas. Like, listening to, virulent conservative talk radio 12 hours a day and watching that kind of stuff on TV. And anytime any kind of news event would happen, it would suddenly be like, oh, well, this is the inside job. Like this is, and for me, it was like, oh yeah, as a kid, you think that's just fascinating. You're like, oh,
right.
My parents are so smart. They know something that other people don't know.
So this was both your parents were kind of into this type of thing?
Yeah. And I would say that, I think we maybe do ourselves a disservice just as people living in the 21st century to have this kind of idea that maybe every conspiracy theorist looks like Dale Gribble, because they're not like that, like not everyone's in their basement, like doing the research or whatever. Sometimes it's just people who kind of like you mentioned in your book, like have a mindset or maybe a proclivity. And what's so kind of pernicious about it is that we can't narrow down, what it is. Is it like an affluence thing? Is it an intelligence thing? Is it a diet thing? What's the thing? And the answer is we still really don't know. Maybe there isn't a thing. I think that's kind of a conclusion you came to as well, where you were like,
yeah,
we don't exactly know. So yeah, my parents weren't like wearing tinfoil hats or anything, but they were certainly, each of them in different veins, open to these kinds of like different ideas. And so growing up, that was just normal to me. I don't know that they ever had, I'm from Oklahoma City, so, the Murrah building bombing, very close to us. I don't know that they ever had any like detailed kind of conspiracies or ideas regarding that, but they kind of have this general tendency to always just be like, oh, there's more to the story, as in kind of like to hand wave away and be like, oh, well, there's something happening behind the scenes. Like, I think the whole discussion of the Murrah bombing probably revolves around like the Clintons and like their Whitewater real estate thing, and like
right.
a lot of information that was supposedly stored there.
Do you remember like when that happened? I mean, you must have been fairly young back then.
Yeah, so I'm 29 now. That happened in 1995. I would have been about like 4 or 5.
So when would you kind of be first aware that your parents were kind of a bit out of the mainstream?
Honestly, as a kid, I didn't see it. A lot of this
Right.
stuff came to light, like I said, later. The first big sort of maybe my parents aren't quite normal happened for me in college, when I had that like, required break away from them, where it's like, oh, I'm going to college, I'm on campus, I'm at a dorm, and just kind of having that time of relax or away from them. And then also being exposed to new ideas, new information, different stuff, it was enough for me to go, hey, this is different.
Yeah.
These people think differently.
It's funny. It kind of reminds me of a story I heard once, which was, I think, just on a kind of NPR, This American Life type thing. And they were doing an episode about things people never realized that were wrong until they talked to them, talked to other people about it. And there was this one girl who her family had chicken with every single meal, and she loved it. She thought that's what people did, and she said for her it seemed perfectly normal. And she went through her entire young life believing that everybody had chicken every single meal.
Yeah.
And then she went to college, and she discovered there's this whole new world of people who don't eat chicken. And it was like a revelation to her. And of course, now looking back on it, she realizes how silly it was.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if, like, you going to college is a bit like that. You didn't have exposure to this wider array of people, and then all of a sudden you're forced into it, and you get a realization.
Well, and I think a huge part of it too is like it's sort of a mental heuristic. Like I mentioned earlier, everything always just defaults back to, oh, well, there's something else. There's more to the story. You know what I mean? It's argumentatively moving the goalposts, I guess you could say, in the sense that it's always like, oh, well, there's always something else that's outside of the conversation,
Yeah.
And so no matter what it is, any event, and I mean, that's what we're seeing now with so much stuff in the news where it's like, it doesn't matter. They always just go one further. And it's like, there's nothing there. It's very tenuous. It's just.
So by default, you're saying like whatever's in the news is disinformation. If something happens, then the official story is the false story. Like dinner is always chicken. So it's like this default thing that you think of.
Yeah, I think, that's a great kind of example you brought up with the thing from NPR. Like, I think most people probably have those things in their life where they don't know until they go out in the world and they discover, oh, that is a little different, But you would hope that it's maybe more for more people in the vein of the chicken for dinner thing versus the distrust of all possible information thing.
I think everyone has a story like that. My story like that is that when I came to America the first time, I got a taxi from the airport to the place where I was staying. This was like 25 years ago. And as we got on the freeway, the guy in the taxi turned on his meter. And at the same time that happened, I saw this sign by the side of the freeway entrance that said meter on. And so I assumed, being new to America, that this sign meant that taxi drivers had to turn their meters on where they got on the freeway, and this sign was to remind them. And I believed this for the next, 15 years or so, until I mentioned it to my wife. I said, hey, did you know what those signs are for? They're to remind taxi drivers to turn their meters on. I was like 40 or something by that point. And I genuinely believed this because it had got stuck in my head. But of course, what it is a sign letting you know that the traffic is being metered by the stoplights. I don't know if you have them in your state, but it's a California thing. The on-ramps, they have signs that light up to tell you when the traffic metering, which means the one car per red type thing getting onto the freeway thing, is up and running. And I just felt so incredibly stupid. But because it happened to me at a time when I was younger, and I guess like it was an entirely new world. I didn't know how America worked. It was my first time in America, and I saw this coincidence that led me to believe this thing, which is entirely ridiculous in hindsight, why they would have these special light up signs to remind taxi drivers to turn their meters on.
Well, and I think part of that is too, like you come into it sometimes with these like neural contexts, right? Like you said, like everything had to be fascinating and new. So like you refuse to let anything be banal. Like you were like, it can't just be about like traffic lights. It's got to be like, they're courteously reminding taxi drivers. And like, that's a really easy, 2 bits of data that you just went and put them together.
Indeed.
And then held on to it for 15 years.
Well, there was nothing I never thought about it afterwards.
You wouldn't.
Yeah, which kind of reminds me of like something you mentioned is that you used to. And we're probably getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but if you didn't realize that, for example, there was a NIST report about 9/11, then it would just kind of never kind of occurs to you to think about it. But let's talk about that later, because it's kind of like later on in the story. So you're growing up a young conspiracy theorist when your parents are both conspiracy theorists. which is kind of interesting because a lot of the people I talk to, I ask them, how did you get into conspiracy theories? And they say, I watched a video.
Yeah, and
And yeah,
I
they
mean
watched.
that kind of like dovetails later for sure.
Right. So
Um,
would you say like did you have an evolution of the type of conspiracy theorist you were after you went to college?
so I would say college for me, and especially like middle to late freshman year when I was, 20, 19, 20, was probably like the nadir of conspiracy
Hmm.
sort of mindset. And again, I think a lot of that was, my mind must have been like fertile for that kind of thinking, given like
Right.
my parents are very untrustworthy of other people, the government. I mean, just regular paranoid kind of thinking all of the time. And so I think I had that kind of built in. And then this was still, I mean, it sounds ridiculous to call something like 2011 like the early days of the internet, but it was definitely a different internet time
Yeah,
than now, if
definitely.
that makes any
Yeah.
sense.
I guess the early days of social media in a way.
Yeah, it was kind of like the dawn of like internet 2.0, like that
Yeah.
social media thing. Like YouTube was kind of coming into its stride as like what we know it of now, like this
Hmm.
content platform. And that is when, yeah, like I remember being exposed to ideas like loose change and things like that, kind of at the end of high school, maybe 15 through 18. That's when, and all of my friends were, people that were also into that in high school, whether or not that was like, the only thing they cared about, or if they also had other hobbies and activities, it wasn't always the same. But, it was very much reinforced with my friends. They'd be like, oh, look at this new thing, or have you watched this video? And we had this kind of
Hmm.
currency of YouTube videos, if that makes any sense.
Sure. Yeah.
And, you see loose change and you're 16 or 15 or whatever, and you're like, oh my God, how can people not know this? Like it's revelatory. You think, oh wow, it's so obvious. It's right there. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
part of it is, I mean, this is like likely what, cult leaders and stuff do as well. Part of the mechanism of getting people beguiled into that, I think, is the sheer length. And it
Mm.
like erodes some of your, abilities to withstand otherwise spurious information, just because you don't have maybe the fortitude, after 2, 3, 4 hours, you're just sitting there watching, you're like, yeah, okay, yeah, ooh, yeah. I mean, I think arguably the same thing happens with TV and news media, but that's a whole different kind of conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like there's so much stuff that in these these videos that you can't really just kind of focus on one thing and then try to say, debunk that one thing or whatever, because it's just overwhelming. I kind of
I
feel
mean,
that.
it's an inundation. And I think that's the point.
So it was like a group of friends that you were kind of sharing these videos with.
Yeah, I mean, it was like my main friend circle.
Right. Did they have similar backgrounds to you in terms of like, the family backgrounds, or did they kind of, do you think they came into it in a different way?
I think it was maybe a little different. Uh, from what I recall in high school, my friend group, for the most part, was pretty unremarkable in the sense that
Mm.
it's like, other kids from the burbs,
Yeah.
kids named like Tyler, Patrick, that kind of thing. Just people that, maybe skateboarded a little bit or
Uh-huh.
played in bands or were in orchestra with me, stuff like that.
Right. So just kind of typical teenagers, and they're just kind
Yeah.
of sharing these things because they're cool and interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's a huge part of it too, is like at that age, your mind is exploding trying to make connections or see things. We see this in like a lot of the biographies of like really intelligent people like Da Vinci or whatever, is like that very formative, 15 to 25 age or whatever. Your mind is like electric. It's just trying to do all these fascinating
Hmm.
things. That's why we
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
this kind of like trope, I think, of young entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs and, all those people. And
Yeah.
so
And
instead of channeling that maybe in some better direction, if that's fair, it gets channeled into just spinning these wheels of weird thoughts.
Yeah, it's just like you're, I don't know, maybe it's like some kind of evolutionary thing that's when you leave your parents, you form your own identity. And they call it like the formative years. I don't know if that would be the formative years in like when you go to college,
Yeah.
it kind of defines who you are as a person, or when when you leave high school and enter the workforce or whatever, it kind of solidifies you as a person. I know I was very personally kind of very volatile as a person back in my late teens and early 20s. That was when I kept a journal, and I read the journal now, and it's all full of philosophical musings and thoughts about the nature of the universe and how to change the world and things like that.
Yeah.
Which is,
And I think everyone has that, or
Mhm.
hopefully everyone has that kind of like burgeoning period or whatever. But yeah, sometimes that gets channeled into weird places. And like, I think that's a lot of what we're experiencing now, especially, with like QAnon and everything else that's going on with that. It's just humans want to be creative. They want to think interesting thoughts. And sometimes that goes unchecked. And that might be an issue.
How did you kind of develop from there then? You said like it was the nadir of your conspiracism.
So that would have been, yeah, around like end of freshman year in college. And what happened with that, and this is, I think, probably something I addressed in my email to you to kind of give you a little background, is that I was spending a lot of time just on my laptop in my dorm room, like 4 to 6 hours a day sometimes like deep into the night, you know, researching this stuff. And you can get lost. I mean, it's the rabbit hole. We have that phrase
Hmm.
for a reason. You start off, let me just try to see if I can remember some of this or map it out. Like, 1 minute you maybe are thinking to yourself, why do we have this pyramid on the dollar? And the next thing you know, 6 hours later, you're researching like ancient Sumerian religions and like
Yeah.
reptiles from outer space who have, like inseminated earth women, and they like are here to take our gold, and they're all transdimensional, and you're just reading all this stuff and you're like, oh, okay. And like one thing leads to another thing. That's how you get I was on like the David Icke train. And I don't mean necessarily that like I believed 100% what this guy was saying, but a lot of kind of what I think was going on for me in that period had maybe less to do with thinking any of these things were true necessarily, and more to do with just voraciously consuming
Hmm.
the next thing. Because it felt like there was never enough information. Like I always had to just find out the next thing, okay, so it's shape-shifting lizards, but what else? And then it's like, oh, it's, Nazi 13-foot giants that live under the crust of the earth. And you're like, yes, but what
Hmm.
else?
So when you doing this research, did you write stuff down?
I don't think so, no. And I didn't like save links or anything. It was just a lot of searching and going and searching and going.
Right.
Um,
It's interesting because it doesn't seem like if you're studying, you're a student at college, then you would have a notebook and you'd take notes about things. You wouldn't just be consuming the content. And
yeah, and I
people do
think
describe it as research.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it now that I'm kind of like thinking about it out loud is like, I think there are a lot of people maybe just like me who are participating in what they perceive to be research, but rather it's just
Hmm.
no different than watching a lot of Netflix. You know what I mean? It's just
Yeah, yeah.
weirdly flavored Netflix. And
It's almost like
certainly for me, like that's definitely what it's become now. I mean, kind of like I mentioned with the whole wallpaper thing in the Oval Office or whatever. It's like I kind of scan things
right.
occasionally to see like what's up, or I try to keep current, I guess,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
mostly as a point of amusement, because kind of like going back to the loose change and like this waterfall of information that comes over you. I think part of the tactic when it comes to, for lack of a better term, this is going to be kind of charged, but when it comes to like indoctrinating people into these beliefs, part of it is to just shotgun a lot of really detailed information at them to where it is so overwhelming. And I'm sure you've had this experience too. Like, you don't have the opportunity to stop them at every single point and say,
Yeah.
hold on, let's address this one point. This is false because, and they're 102 points down the road. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so your
Yeah.
brain kind of goes into this shut off mode where it's like, oh, well, I guess, I mean, dang, this is so much information. It must be right. And it's like, no,
Yeah. Have you heard the term Gish Gallop?
no.
It's quite famous in kind of debunking and skepticism circles, and it was a technique invented by a guy named Gish, who was a preacher, and he used to debate, atheists or whatever, or people who weren't of the same religion as him, and he had a technique where he would basically just rattle off points one after another, like from the Bible and from his work and whatever, and he. Whenever he had a debate with somebody, this was his way of basically swamping them with so many points that they couldn't possibly respond to all of them.
Yeah.
So he would fire off like 15 or 20 things just in one response to one question, and then the person would just kind of try to pick one of those and do a detailed response to it, and then he would just come back with the 14 that he missed, and then add another 15 on top of that. And this is something that you see in a lot of people who are spreading some kind of disinformation, or who want to persuade people of their point of view and aren't perhaps entirely honest about what they're doing, is that they just swamp them with these things. Like if you look at flat Earth, for example, completely
Yeah.
ridiculous example, but there's a famous thing which is 200 proofs the Earth is flat by Eric Dubay, which is based on an older thing, 100 proofs the Earth is flat from the 1800s. But having a lot of things, in some ways, it just overloads the brain, and you just can't respond to it, and you almost kind of just give up in a way.
Well, I think that's like kind of talking about that. That's like what we see even just on TV, like on the news, like
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of like Neil Postman's criticism of television in the sense that it decontextualizes everything by just rapid firing this information at you with no context. And so then your context becomes the universe of all contexts, not because you chose to make it that, but just because the brain kind of defaults to that. And so, you see this, I think, on a lot of like news now where they'll go to discuss a point, but rather, since they only have 90 seconds or 2 minutes
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, it becomes, well, let me say a bunch of really sensational kind of sentences that will make great sound bites. And the other person who they brought on kind of almost as the sacrificial character goes, hey, well, let me talk about that one thing with a little nuance. And they're like, nope,
Yeah,
it's over. And
yeah.
so
Or
I
you
think
get one
people kind of,
sentence.
yeah, people kind of, I think, get these very, at that point, like flat interpretations of things, just
Yeah,
goings on.
yeah. You certainly see that in the news, and I've been watching NPR news, which is better in some regards. Obviously, it's got kind of a liberal bias to a degree, but I found myself when I started watching it, I was kind of surprised at just how long they would spend talking about a thing, because I kind of expected this very rapid fire thing where they would ask them two
Yeah.
questions and then they move on to the next person. But sometimes they would talk to someone for like 5 minutes, and I'd be like, "Whoa, what is this? Like a documentary or something?" But because your expectations become this just kind of sound bite type information stream.
Well, and I think, I mean, again, Neil Postman talks about this a lot, but kind of an interesting point is, you know, back in the day, like in the middle of the 19th century, when presidents had debates, those were like whole day affairs. Like Lincoln would have 3 hours, the other guy had 3 hours, then Lincoln had 90 minutes, the other guy had 90 minutes, and then it was like 30 minutes, 30 minutes. That was
Mm-hmm.
the day. And so you definitely have an opportunity to have much more nuanced understandings of things versus now it's just like, we throw two people up and they've got 60 minutes, 2 hours maybe, and they're just trying to hit the highlights. And so I think, I mean,
Yeah,
but this goes way off into like my ideas about, I think we have a poor relationship with certain medias
sure.
currently, like I think that's part of it's structural, like this conspiracy thinking and stuff like that. is maybe endemic to the ways that we are communicating in the 21st century, and
Yeah.
maybe not having like stop gaps or fail safes or something, because we're living in this really frothy, statistical, information rich
Yeah.
environment.
Yeah. Really
And
complicated environment. I think it's complicated, and we didn't have the access to all this information before, so we had a much
yeah,
simpler view of the world.
and I think part of the issue is like our brains, we're not wired for statistical kind of thinking. We're wired for this like, linear sort of connective narrative. That's why people crave these patterns. People crave these stories. We tell stories. That's part of like Homo sapiens. We tell stories. That's part of having these cool brains.
Yeah.
And we want to connect those dots. And so we see all these data points. We see all this stuff happening in the universe. We're like, oh, let's make a story out of it. Do you see why these people are obviously running a pedophile cabal out of a pizza shop? And you're like, I didn't before, but I do now. Like,
So you were deep into it. You said you were watching videos like 4 to 6 hours a day or more,
yeah.
and
And yeah,
then things changed.
it's one of those things, it's going to sound weird because I really can't describe it exactly. Um, I think I noticed like maybe some strain in relationships with some people in my life because I was a little obsessive with some of these ideas. And it's one of those things, it doesn't make for very polite conversation, right? So
Mm.
it's running in your head all the time. You're thinking about it, but because it requires like so much to just bring people up to speed, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can't just like go and say, oh, well, hey, this guy that actually just wears teal tracksuits and believes in whack shit. Yeah, you just can't.
They have no context
Yeah,
to understand what you're saying.
you sound. I think that reinforces that like isolation that a lot of people run into with this is because you're like, oh, well, nobody understands me, and I'm the only person that understands the truth, so I got to find other people maybe that are like me. And I got to this point where I was like, man, I feel like I may be alienating some people in my life. And, several nights maybe of just doing this from 11 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning and then sleeping a few hours and going to class. It was after one of those kind of like all night YouTube binges or something. I just looked up and I'm like, I'm tired. And
Hmm.
what was the fucking point? Like it just kind of dawned on me. I was like, look, this is all fascinating. Maybe some of it's true. Maybe none of it's true. I was like, and this is what I told you. I was like, even if it's all true, every single bit of it, whatever my like particular conspiracy of choice was at that time, like what was I going to do about it? Because like a lot of these, especially the more you delve into the like macro conspiracies, like the ones that encompass everything, the universal Catholic
Mm.
conspiracies, right?
Illuminati.
Exactly. Once you get into those, you really have to ask yourself, like, okay, if there really is this like society of Masons or whomever that have been guiding humanity for tens of thousands of years or whatever the idea is, it's like, how is me on a message board at
Hmm.
3:30 in the morning? Like, am I doing anything? Like, or am I just, if it's true, I can't do anything because these guys have had this shit on lock for thousands of years. And if it's not true, then it's a waste of time. Like, then I'm literally using my real time, my real energy, my real life force on something that's just not real.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it kind of gives me the idea that realizing you couldn't do anything about it kind of gave you mental permission to kind of question whether it was true or not. Because if you felt like you could do something about it, then it would be very important to discover the truth behind the world, and so you wouldn't want to let doubt creep in because you were so convinced that it was this really, really important thing that way you were actually, saving the world by exposing these things. But
Yeah.
if you then think, oh, well, there's nothing I could do about it anyway, perhaps you don't worry about it so much. And then you get to actually start analyzing it more. I don't know.
Yeah. I think that's interesting for sure.
Yeah, I hear people kind of have conspiracy fatigue, and this, especially with things like the 9/11 people. They've been believing that 9/11 was an inside job for like nearly 20 years now, and at a certain point they realize that it's not going to change. There's no traction, and the theory is kind of not going anywhere, and they move away from it. But it's not clear if they just simply get tired of it, and just still believe it but just move away from it, or if they actually um, start to question it and start to think that it's not true. I mean, when you went through this change yourself, and you thought, like, what's the point if it's true or if it's false? Same deal. Did you then start to change in the way you actually believed that there was something going on?
So I think it happened gradually, and I think for most people it probably does, hopefully. But for me, it was like that first kind of night of being like, I've got other things I got to do.
Hmm.
I literally just wasted, I guess, but like, 8, 9 hours of my night of my life staying up all night looking into this stuff. And I really have things to do today. You know what I mean? Like, it's legitimately going to affect me. So it was like, that was the first big kind of aha moment of like, maybe this is unhealthy. Maybe this is like a poor thing. And I'd already kind of picked up on, people maybe being weirded out by some of this stuff. And like I said, the general alienation of other people in my life. And so that was kind of the big aha moment for me, where I was like, look, I'm just going to, shut it down, not pay attention to any of this stuff for a while. And, because a lot of these things are predicated in some way on like paranoia or fear, like it would come back up occasionally, over time. But just like anything else, like the cycles were greater each time. So it started out like I wouldn't think about it for a day. And, a day turned into a week, into a month. And then it got to the point where, it had been so long that I would look back on some of that and be like, that was kind of ridiculous. Yeah, that was maybe not my proudest moment. But again, I think part of it is you get so into, especially again, like I said, the universal conspiracies, whatever they are, the Rothschilds, the Jews, you get to a point where some of it just doesn't seem tenable, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe.
It's like, how would it work? How would this?
Yeah, like
how would they even do this?
The curious tinkerer in my brain is always like, detail-wise, like how would it work? Like,
yeah.
I often tell people that I'm like simultaneously the most credulous and skeptical person they'll meet in a day, because like I want to drink someone's punch. Like, I'm there for it. Like, tell me about your thing, and then I want to pick it apart, because I want to see exactly like how it could be true or not true. And I think the problem is people don't often get to that pick it apart stage. Like you said, like, how does it work? Because at the end of the day, when you really start peeling apart some of these larger conspiracies or more engrossing conspiracies, like the idea that some of these things would be covered up or how they would work in the real world, it's like, this would involve what, 300, 400, 500,000 people, and they're all in on it? That seems doubtful. How would 500,000 people keep something like that quiet?
Yeah, and that's something that I always bring up with things like 9/11, when you consider that pretty much over half of all FBI agents were tasked with investigating 9/11. So either they were entirely inept, or half of the FBI or the entire FBI was in on it. And of course, some people will go with that explanation, and they will say that millions of people are in on these conspiracy theories. Yeah, like, if you already think that the entire news media is telling you lies on a daily basis, which, of course, there's various shades of that, but on the extreme level of the news media being complicit in covering up things like 9/11 conspiracy theories or chemtrails and things like that, it's a lot of people, and it's pretty implausible. And some of the reasons people give for that being plausible don't seem plausible at all to me. They say, well, people are afraid of losing their pensions so they keep quiet. This is the weakest excuse possible.
Well, I think you've probably mentioned this before too. Like, there are certain events that occur that are then subsequently taken advantage of in some capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And then that is a foothold for people to be like, ah, see?
Yes.
And
It's
it's like,
the who benefits thing.
exactly. And it's one of those things, like, especially having done more and more research on 9/11, it's like, look, this is very likely, something that just happened. 19 terrorists, Al Qaeda, they did this thing, and then other people capitalized on it. Yeah, there's definitely a conversation to be had about like media capitalizing on that, of government and executive branch capitalizing on terror. There's
Yeah.
absolutely something we need to discuss as a post-industrial society about how we respond to those things. Should people be able to leverage that in such a way? Of course. But to get to the point where you're saying like laser beams, missiles, aliens, it's like that ain't it.
It's quite amazing what people will accept. And I think in a way you gave yourself some space, which then allowed you to revisit things with fresh perspective. It's like the old saying that the best way to improve your writing when you're writing something or whatever you're doing, or composing music or whatever, is to put it aside for a few days or even a week or so, and then come back and look at it with fresh eyes. And you can't make much progress on things like that if you're just completely in it and you don't have this perspective from the outside. So just the fact that you got tired and gave yourself a bit of time off and then came back is actually something that I recommend people try doing. Like, just don't do it for a week and then come back and look at it again and see if it feels different.
And I think a lot of it, I mean, it's an addiction. It's
Mm-hmm.
um, I think people are having this same kind of problem now with like their phones when it comes to information addiction or just like sensory stimulation addiction. Because I think everyone's kind of gotten to the point, where you look at your phone for the umpteenth time in the day and you're like, why the hell did I just do that? It's like
Mm-hmm.
you just got the twitch. You just got to do it. And I think it's the same with some of these thoughts and these ideas, because you're just sitting there refreshing forums and like constantly trying to find that next thing. And it's an addiction.
Yeah, no, I have a problem too.
Yeah.
It's I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook and I'm on my Metabunk forum.
I mean, I deleted Instagram like a couple of months ago because I was like, I got stuff to do in my life.
I deleted what was it, World of Warcraft,
Oh,
the video game, because I could feel myself getting addicted to it when I started playing it, and I could feel the repetitive behavior and the little rewards that it gives you, and I could feel myself getting sucked into it. So yeah,
it
it's
takes
kind of
that
like
one instance of like looking down at the clock and it being 7 o'clock and then looking back again and it's 4 hours later and you're like, oh, what? And then you're like, okay, maybe pump the brakes.
yeah. No, I can totally see that. I used to be addicted to the news when I was young, and I actually used to watch the news, TV news, between like 5 o'clock and 11 o'clock. On days when I had nothing else to do, I would just sit in front of the TV and watch the news in the UK, because the different channels would have their news programs at different times, and I think there was a 1 hour break in the middle where I could have my dinner. But yeah, I can totally understand this feeling of being sucked into this information stream, which yeah, I guess it somehow triggers little receptors in your brain to release little bits of chemicals when they see the recognition.
Well, I think in a lot of ways, kind of talking about my collegiate experience, I was blessed because I didn't watch TV in college.
Mm,
You know, I think growing up, like I've throughout my life maybe had this thread of like trading an addiction for another, whatever that might be at the time. And most recently, it's kind of transmogrified itself into a caffeine addiction, which is
right.
socially acceptable. So it works. But earlier years, 13 to 18 or whatever, TV was the thing. I can think back now to just watching all kinds of stuff into the middle of the night, and this
Yeah.
just like, oh, well, Three's Company's on, Roseanne's on, just watch another episode. And it's like, why?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think, 18, 19-year-old me saw some of that behavior. It's like, look, this is probably not meaningful to you. And so I stopped watching TV in college. I was just like, yeah, I'm going to take time off of TV. It was kind of a decision I made. And for like 4 or 5 years, didn't watch TV in college really. I mean, I would watch it if I was like at a friend's house or obviously if we were watching a movie or something. But this idea of just like passive engagement with television. And that really kind of reset me going into my like mid to late 20s to where now it's like going out to restaurants, which obviously no one's done in like a year or so, but you know what I mean? Like going out places, if there are just all these TVs on, it's very distracting to me. But other people have normalized that. That's, you know, a kind of baseline din of just information at them. And I'm like, I can't do this. This is very stimulating, you know,
Yeah, so some people have the TV on in their house all day long,
all day long.
like from morning till the evening, which, I think obviously a lot of people find that perfectly normal and they can get along with that. But for me, it's I turn on the TV when I want to watch something specific and then just do it for a certain period of time. And the idea of having the TV on all day long has been very distracting for me, and I don't like it at all. I can't because when the TV's on, I get sucked into it, and there it is. That's the
Yeah,
TV. I gotta
I'm the
watch
same
it.
way.
Yeah, I can't. If I'm trying to work on something, I end up just watching the TV instead. But I wonder if like that kind of influences people's mindset in terms of how susceptible they are for conspiracy theories. If they're so used to just consuming a stream of information all the time, like if they grew up and they had Fox News or whatever or CNN or even just like ABC on the TV all day long, they would kind of expect to have an information stream all the time, just in the background. And YouTube would be a natural next step for that. You just go on
Sure, you would
YouTube
just,
and
well, people do that now. Yeah, people in my generation for sure. You know, it's all YouTube and you're just
yeah,
chain videos. And YouTube's like, we got this really awesome algorithm. It's going to tell you what you want to watch next. And you're like, yeah, sure, you want to watch that.
yeah,
Well, I think
yeah.
that's
They're
an
trying.
interesting point. I don't know. This kind of goes back to my whole like conversation with television and Neil Postman and stuff. But there's a guy I think named Jerry Mander who wrote a book called Four Arguments for the Elimination of Television,
Mm,
and he wrote it in the late 70s. And so
wow.
obviously some of the data is different now. We probably, hopefully, have more information. But I mean, it's still a very cogent kind of argument about this medium, right? Because
Yeah,
now the only conversation that's had is the content on the medium, not the medium as such. We don't really ever critique the medium as such. You know, back in the 50s and the 60s and 70s, people were still having that conversation about like, is TV really a good idea for a democratic
mm,
society? Now it's just like, should we have titties on TV? And it's like different realms. But in it, he talks about how um, they've done studies to show that when you're watching television, and I assume all of this likely holds true for YouTube videos and things like that. I mean, it's very much the same kind of idea because you're participating in only two sensory engagements, sight and sound. It kind of puts your mind in like this quasi hypnotic state. You know,
mm.
they've checked brain wavelengths, and that's what they've discovered is that you kind of become more docile and, I mean, more receptive to whatever you're just ingesting or receiving constantly. And so I think, honestly, in my kind of opinion, that's maybe where we get this idea of like subliminal messages and brainwashing or whatever. It's like, yeah, that kind of idea maybe is occurring at some level in the sense that people are lulled into this docile mental state to where they're then just like fed, you know, bits of information and sound bites that they take as, you know, rule and law and fact. But the idea that it's like, you know, they're flashing a picture of a hot dog and they're like, I gotta go buy a hot dog. Like, very unlikely. That's not, I think, how it's working exactly.
Yeah,
And I don't think
yeah,
that there's some grand cabal of, you know, Nielsen report people who are like, oh, we're going to brainwash the masses. I think it's just something that's kind of, again, endemic to the technology that we're not aware of. And it's the same with social media, where it's like there are certain things that are maybe happening in that technological sphere that we're not privy to. We don't know because it's only 10 years old, you know? And so we've got a lot of maybe blindness to these things.
it's only 10 years old, but it's evolving, I think, a lot faster than TV did. I mean, TV was Although TV has evolved, obviously, quite a bit. If you watch some of the old TV, it's like ridiculous variety shows with people playing the piano and singing, which you don't see that anymore. But let's move on to like one of the reasons you talked to me was that you read my book.
Yeah.
What you emailed me, and you said it kind of gave you kind of a new perspective, I guess, on some of the stuff that you had been percolating in the background.
Yeah. Kind of the story was I had made, I read books all the time, and I'd made kind of a reading list of just conspiracy theory books or conspiratorial sort of thinking. And I think yours was, of all those books, maybe like 5 or 6 books, where I was like, I just want to read something about this. It was the only one that had an audiobook available. So I was like, okay, well, I'll read that first, or listen to it rather.
Right. Yeah.
Because especially at the end of 2020, I think it is very clear that there's a lot of just that mindset in the world now. And as somebody who had come kind of from that, it was very readily apparent to me where it's like what used to be very fringe sort of ideas have now been moved to just like casual conversation points. And like people that I would just assume would never in my regular life have contact with some of these ideas or information were bringing it up like it was common. And for me, that was a little disturbing. And so initially I set out to research and read on just like, what is the conspiracy mindset? Like what makes people think these things? And obviously, like I have my own ideas that, we're participating with television and social media in ways that we don't necessarily understand. And that's certainly a part of it. But for me, I was like, what's causing that? Like when you go out and make the proclamation that the entire DNC is a group of satanic worshiping pedophiles who are participating in blood ritual sacrifices and they're stealing an election on a massive scale, and that's just like something you think is common parlance, it's like that's bizarre. And that was happening several kind of places in my reality, whether it was coworkers or whomever. And I was like, yeah, a lot of, again, these ideas that used to be very fringe have become very mainstream. And for me, that was disturbing. And so I wanted to look into that. I wanted to be like, well, what makes people think these things? How do they get there? What's that all about? And so I started listening to your book. And I was like, I think I read maybe the blurb on Amazon or something. And I was like, yeah, seems good to me. Like, why do people, think about conspiracy? Or why do they believe what they do? And I was like, that's intriguing. And then I think at the very beginning of it, you kind of net out what you're going to do throughout the course of the book. So you talk about how, the idea is you run the whole book saying, pretend you have a friend. Maybe the friend is you. Maybe it's just actually a friend that you're trying to take care of or help in some capacity. And like, here's what we're going to do to kind of maybe at the very best, steer them in a little bit of a different direction or provide them more information about some of these things. And I was like, okay, cool. I don't know if this is me driving in my car. I was like, I don't know if this is exactly what I signed up for, but I'm like, I'll listen to it, whatever. I've got it already. I think I mentioned this to you in your email where, or in my email to you, where when you mention things like, yeah, we'll talk about flat earth and, talk about chemtrails, my mind is immediately like, yeah, that's easy to debunk. Those are bullshit. And then you're like, we'll talk about Sandy Hook, 9/11. And then kind of very deep in my mind, I was like, well, okay, maybe I'll listen to whatever he has to say about Sandy Hook, but 9/11, I was like, everyone knows 9/11 was an inside job. And like, this is me just driving, just think about this. And like, there's no way. This guy's not going to get it. He's not going to get me. You know what I meant? I was like, and that was something I hadn't thought actively about for years. Again, you mentioned people maybe get conspiracy fatigue and then move on to something else. Like that probably kind of happened to me with 9/11 Truth and stuff, where I had cemented a lot of those ideas, in 2011, 2012, whenever, and then I had just simply never revisited them. But they were still ideas that I had to where, any day of the week, if somebody was like, well, how did 9/11 happen? Then that would have been like, oh, well, let me tell you about that. So yeah, you kind of talk about these 4 conspiracies that we're going to cover throughout the book. And again, chemtrails for me, automatic no-go, because I can remember being in third grade and reading the science textbook, and you're in the like meteorology section, and it's like, here are the different types of clouds, and sometimes airplanes make contrails because they just condense an atmosphere and make clouds. 9-year-old me was like, that makes perfect sense. And so like I've never even thought twice about it. I was like, yeah, that they're just clouds. If you're like, but they're spraying chemicals, it's like literally no, just no. And then flat Earth, obviously,
Yeah.
to talk about. But yeah, 9/11 and Sandy Hook. And so Sandy Hook was one of those ones because I formerly fell into the category of dispelling everything immediately as false flag. I think I maybe picked that up from my parents or whatever. And so it got to a point, what was one of the more recent ones, like Vegas, Pulse, or whatever, where I wouldn't even go back and research anything. Like I wouldn't care. I would just see that something happened in the news. It was a mass shooting. I'd be like, it was probably a Black Ops SEAL team. And like, there would be nothing to check me about this. Like, I would just think that. And so that's kind of where we were when I was listening to this book, and then you mentioned people's respective stories with each one of those deals. And then we get to kind of covering the brunt of 9/11 stuff. And, I think it's interesting. You talk a lot about like AE 9/11 truth. I somehow was never even aware of those people until your book. And so I think maybe having steered clear of that was maybe to my benefit. But you mentioned, several things. You're like, hey, here's some proof, here's some evidence, here's some information. And one of the ones you mentioned was the NIST report from 2005. And so me, like, I'm not in this to be an advocate for a conspiracy theory or another. Like, I'm in it to just know as much as we can, like the quest for truth, if you will. And so when you're like, oh, hey, there's a NIST report, I thought to myself, oh, well, I've never even heard of it. I never even knew that. And I went and pulled it up and I researched it and read it for a few hours. And it's like, yep, like we're done here. Like there's not much more to talk about. And then I saw all of the NIST videos that they've made where you're talking about teams of structural engineers and code designers and fireproofing experts and professionals who spent their lives, their livelihoods, lifetimes researching this stuff, putting everything into this like 300-page report. And it's like, yep, this is pretty open and shut for me. Like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
And I think I sort of fell into the controlled demolition aspect of the whole thing because, like I mentioned to you, my dad is an architect. And I remember very clearly, like the days after 9/11 and stuff like that. I mean, people forget this, but it was the only thing on TV for weeks, months, like this is in a lot of ways like a pre-contemporary internet world. So
yeah, you got a stream of 9/11 all day long.
People were on the tube all the time, just constantly looking at this stuff. And, I remember him, I think the very first thing he thought was like, yeah, they fell down because of the fires. Like that was like 9/11, day one, that evening or whatever. He's like, buildings catch fire and they collapse. But then after that, he was just, I think, incredulous mostly. Like he couldn't accept that it had happened. And so kind of, I remember it's not like he ever, went crazy and had like whole boards of research on the wall or anything. It was never anything like that. But I think because he couldn't just grasp like the enormity of that particular traumatic episode, he kind of defaulted to being like, it does look like it was demoed. Like that's what buildings look like when they get demoed. And it was never anything that he even maybe said directly to me or to anyone else. It was just kind of like he would be watching this endless stream of TV, and then he would kind of like mutter these things where it looks like controlled demolition, that's him just kind of talking to himself. And 10-year-old me, very impressionable as a 10-year-old, was like, oh, well, that's got to be the truth.
Yeah.
And so like I had, again, that kind of fertile ground for conspiratorial thinking. And, you got all the stuff there. It's like straight from your parents. He's got ethos being an architect. Like, okay, that makes sense. And so then you go from that jumping off point of like, oh, well, I think it must have been design demolition to why did it happen? Who did it? Who set it up? Why was it going on? But then you read that NIST report and you're like, oh, okay, this is way less imaginative in the sense that it doesn't have this massive fantasy story to it, but it's real. Like that's the brass tacks of it all,
Yeah. It's really interesting, your dad being an architect and you not being aware of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which is this organization of architects and engineers who promote the controlled demolition theory, and also not being aware of NIST, because Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, their entire thing is all about saying the NIST report is wrong and here's why it's wrong. But would your dad have been aware of those things, do you think?
I think maybe, again, like my parents were never, they have a very like superficial sort of relationship with things in general, but especially things in the news in particular, where it's like, maybe he thought that, or maybe he has like conspiracy theories in general of things, but he never decides to dig any deeper. It's just like, oh, well, the Democrats want to take your money from taxes because this or some other vague notion about that. And that's really all it ever is. It's always very kind of surface. So the idea that maybe he thought it's some kind of design demolition, but then never explored it any further makes a lot of sense to me. Like he probably would have.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, again, at that time, he would have been in his mid to late 40s. I think there's, the idea that maybe even if he had that thought, he didn't want to pursue it because of like, think of the genuine terror of the implication, right? Like, okay, so it is design demolition, or you follow that hypothesis for a while. Like, what does that mean? In a lot of ways, like that really upends, the fabric of reality. Like, who did this? Why? Why did they do it? Can we trust anyone? And so I think maybe as like a mental protective measure, he was just like, no, I'm not going to think about this anymore.
Yeah, it always reminds me of what you were talking about, like where you recognize that there was harm being done to your life by obsessing about these things, and then what difference could you do anyway? It's this kind of conspiracy fatigue type thing where people just don't. People have their lives in the world where they're doing stuff and getting on with their lives, and then they also have these conspiracy lives sometimes. And I think sometimes you just see this balance shift, like people become obsessed with conspiracy theories up to a point, and then they realize that their real life is suffering, and then the balance kind of shifts. But it doesn't necessarily mean they stop believing in these things. It's just that they don't think about them anymore.
And I mean, that's for sure what happened to me. Like I said, I hadn't thought about it for 7-10 years maybe. Then I think it is very amusing to me, like how visceral it was, though, when you were like, we're going to talk about 9/11.
Right.
And I'm just like, no way, dude. Inside job. And then, like I said, I read the NIST report. I looked at a couple of other things where I'm sure have seen all of it at this point, but like the 3D modeling and like heat mapping of World Trade Center 7, where it's like, hey, this is how this happened. And I think a huge part of it is people just aren't familiar with how buildings fall down.
Right.
Like, you mentioned in the book and you talk about the reason it looks like design demolition is because if you paid somebody money to tear these buildings down, that's how they would do it. They would do it in such a way that the building used its own force to fall down on itself. Or like
Building 7.
Yeah, or people have this idea that these buildings are super robust, and it's like, no, kind of the trick is like, the feats of modern engineering and architecture are very amazing. But at the end of the day, like they have tolerances. And once you kind of destroy those tolerances or move beyond it, that's it. Like they're not designed for these extreme case scenarios. I mean, World Trade Center, like WTC2, they talk about it having deflected like 2 feet or more. Like this whole building
more than that, I think.
2 feet and twisted.
Swayed.
Yeah.
Which they were
just
designed to do, to sway a degree in the wind. And if you have
absolutely.
a hurricane, buildings actually do sway noticeably because they have to kind of absorb the hurricane force winds, which the
And,
buildings were designed to do.
and to think about that plane though, impacting it, like 27 inches of deflection, that's a ton for a building that big. Or, you've discussed like momentum, because I think people don't have a good idea of dynamic systems, right?
Mm,
People are like, oh, it's moving faster than free fall. And it's like, well, okay, but like the physics of moving bodies is certainly different when there are so many dynamic elements in this system. It's not just like high school physics, throw a tennis ball and catch it. Like, you've got all of this compounding momentum. You've got stuff. It's very
right.
complex. And
Yeah.
so, go ahead.
So how long ago was this that you kind of you read my book and you had this realization about the NIST report?
Oh, I mean, like I said, when I emailed you, which would have been a few weeks ago now, a month or
Right.
so,
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Well,
had
it's
not yet
just
finished listening to it.
right. Yeah. It's
So,
about 2.5 weeks ago.
and it was one of those things, like, it was just such a kind of a neat moment that I was like,
Mm-hmm.
huh. I mean, I kind of explained it all in the email where I was like, hey, you've changed my
Yeah.
mind. Like,
Well, but given that it's still so new to you in a way, like the NIST report and things like that, do you think there's a possibility that you could be persuaded now in the other direction? Obviously, I don't want to do that, but it seems like when people very rapidly change their mind, is it possible that you could now say someone from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, they get in touch with you and they say like, hey Alex, I heard what you said, and I think you're wrong about this, and I think Mick is wrong about this, and let me show you this. And then they say, here's a professor in Alaska who's done this study on Building 7, and he did all this work of analyzing it and simulating the building, and he proved that it couldn't possibly be collapsed from fire. Do you think you could get sucked back in or re-persuaded?
I mean, this is one of those things. It's interesting you mentioned that, because I kind of had a microscopic sort of similar experience to that already. And this is certainly not maybe the most enlightened position to take, but like, I've kind of made the decision to not wade into some of those spaces. And that happened to me a couple of weeks ago. So I was like looking at those other conspiracy books, or I know what it was specifically. I was reading Amazon reviews for your book.
Yeah, right.
I think I was maybe looking for other suggestions of things to read or whatever, but I was like, well, why do they give them 1 star? I always want to read those 1 stars. And so, someone in there posted a link and like, oh, here's why this is all nonsense. And, I clicked the link and I went there, and it was some website that wasn't even like a secured HTTP, obviously. So it's some like weird part of the internet, and it was like, new information reveals, and it's this like 17-minute video of some guy like explaining why like NIST calculations were wrong and they got all the math wrong or whatever. And I had like this impulse. I was like, oh, well, I should, for the sake of science, like that's the thought, like, oh, to be a reasonable person. And then I was just like, no, like, I don't need to do this, because I realized I wasn't doing anything healthy by like trying to kind of open that back up. Like, it's kind of like you mentioned with World of Warcraft. Like, you kind of feel that
right. Yeah.
reflex very early on. And I noticed that, and I was like, I don't need whatever this guy has to say. And at the end of the day, I kind of also thought, I was like, this guy might cover a lot of stuff, this person, whomever it was, like that I just simply won't understand possibly in a 15 to 17-minute video. And what have I done like beneficially for myself at that point? Like, now I'm just back in the mode of like not believing anything and being untrustworthy of everything because I watched one guy talk about the math for 15, 17 minutes. And then I was like, no, I just got to stay away from this. And again, that's not certainly the most enlightened position, but it's one of it's self-preservation.
Very practical, I think, and realistic, because most people are not going to get a degree in structural engineering just so they can figure out exactly what happened on 9/11. So you're going to have to rely upon the expertise of others. And so you've
But
either got like on the one hand, like NIST and all the structural engineers, the majority of all the structural engineers out there, or you've got this small group of people, and this one guy in Alaska who's telling you something else, and yeah, most people, even I, aren't fully capable of understanding all of the science behind it, and so to a degree, you have to rely upon your understanding of how the world works and whether people would be lying about these things rather than the actual science itself.
well, I think kind of a meaningful point that you could direct with people who talk about like AE 9/11 truth and that stuff is that, and this is something I'm pretty familiar with at this point, doing what I do, being a home and building inspector and like being involved in that world of constructing buildings and making things happen and putting things in reality. And it's like I told you, like I'll be going back to graduate school this year to do a master's in science, construction science. Um, I think people, if they're from the outside, they don't realize that, yeah, somebody can have a structural engineer designation or this license or this training and still fundamentally like maybe not know what they're doing or
Yeah,
not
yeah.
know what they're talking about. It's like any profession anywhere. People can get licensed, get certified, and you're going to have a whole spectrum of humans who participate in that profession,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of the designation. And so you have people who are like, well, there's 1,200 engineers, architects and engineers for 9/11 truth, and they all think this. And it's like, yeah, like, yeah, they're all architects and engineers, but like, that doesn't mean they're all great. And like, a lot of the times you run into people who have like a structural engineer degree from 40, 50 years ago. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay,
A lot of retired people.
yeah, like, it's like, okay, it's technically he's a structural engineer. Yes, this person has done this, but like, there's a difference in, again, I think people just saying they're structural engineers or they're engineers or they're architects, it's a very flattening kind of interpretation because just because one is an architect or is a structural engineer, you know, maybe all that they're familiar with is building nursing homes, building homes, building
Parking lots. One of
industrial
them.
buildings, parking lots, building
Yeah.
traffic control scenarios and
Mm-hmm.
civil engineering, that sort of stuff. Like, and so to sit there and say, okay, maybe this person is a structural engineer, but most structural engineers I know only do homes, only do industrial properties, only do like office and multifamily or something to that effect. They all have this niche. So the idea that you have 1,000 or 1,200 architects and structural engineers who all are familiar and conversant about 1,100-foot tall
Mm-hmm.
buildings is very unlikely.
Yeah.
Like people kind of forget, and again, the magnitude of some of these projects. Like when the World Trade Center was built, it was huge. It was a huge deal in the sense that they are literally. I mean, it was the state of the art of like how to do things. Like the conversation of the external skeleton, like truss design frame, that is the state of the art. Even the elevator technology was like
Mm-hmm.
the state of the art. And
Yeah.
so they had to pull from the best of the best to even make that happen at the time. And yeah, we've obviously taken that and moved forward in architecture and we've, copied it and modeled things off of it since then. But not everyone knows how to build skyscrapers. Not everyone knows about skyscrapers. And the people who do probably literally only do skyscrapers. Or furthermore, and I think this is where people don't appreciate the granularity of like task specificness in these fields, is like the guy who probably designed the hat truss, that was it. That's probably what that guy did. Or, there was a
Yeah.
guy who probably designed like several floors and that's it. You know, like that's how
Yeah.
specific these people's involvement gets. So then this notion that there are these people that just come at it like, well, I'm a structural engineer and let me tell you the what for. And it's like, you can't know everything about this. It literally took hundreds and hundreds of people to even analyze what happened to it, because no one had this corpus of knowledge required to know what was going on.
Yeah. And another thing with structural engineers is that their job is to make a building not fall down. And so they're experts in making it not fail. When what you need is someone who understands how a building will fail and in what way it will fail. Because, you know, if you just make it kind of fail in which in one floor just sags down a little bit, or it just tips over to the side or something like that, that's not going to work. So it's almost like you don't want structural engineers who are concerned with building things. You need structural engineers who are concerned with destroying things, which would be, you know, demolition experts.
Or some kind of like building forensics professional.
Yeah,
there are people that do that, you know, like they probably.
Well, the funny thing there is the guy in Alaska, Dr. Leroy Halsey, is actually a forensic structural engineer, but his expertise is mostly in bridges rather than high-rise buildings. So that's kind of what you were saying before. Yeah, that's a great
point, because it doesn't necessarily translate, you know, and I have a very perfect example for that, like literally in my life, you know, where I was looking for a structural engineer one time for something, and I called up a guy that I knew from college or something, and I was like, hey, you do engineering, right? He's like, yeah, but we do. He literally said it like this. He's like, everything we do is horizontal. You need somebody that does something vertical. Like, that's how he broke it down for me. And I was like, oh, okay. And so, I mean, I think that's a fair point, even if you're a guy in Alaska. It's like, it's not the same.
Well, it'd be interesting to see if you do actually look into this more, if you find any credence in their arguments, because I know exactly what anyone who's watching this or listening to this who is a believer in architects and engineers for 9/11 truth, they're just going to say that you haven't looked into the facts of AE 9/11, and therefore you don't you would be persuaded if you had looked into it. This is one of those things, like, you know, they put out these long videos that kind of look persuasive on the face of it, but really they're full of holes because they're only arguing from one perspective.
Well, and again, I think the videos are so ensorceling because people don't understand that the data are so cherry picked in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like the same with World Trade Center 7, right? Where they're like, see, look, this building looks fine. This building looks fine. And then it's like, no one ever shows, what is it, the south side that's literally been covered in debris and ripped pieces and full of fire. And like,
yeah,
like all of the fire chiefs that day, they were like, yeah, we're just not going to touch it. Did everyone get out of the building? Great. Okay. We're not going to do anything. Like, we can't do anything.
Yeah, and the firemen saying the building's going to collapse, which of course the conspiracy theorists take as being that the firemen were told that the building was going to be demolished, which then leads you to that everybody in the fire department, everybody around there, had to be in on the conspiracy. So it's
well, what's interesting to me is, you know, you have these, like, it's one thing to go off maybe the deep end with the firefighters saying it, but like, firefighters probably have been around buildings that have collapsed, you know, like that makes sense. Like, that's probably a story that gets shared amongst that community. Like, Inferno is raging long enough, like if it's a sufficient conflagration, like
you'll see it creaking and sagging and hear the noises.
But I mean, I went through and watched like a ton of 9/11 footage a few weeks ago, just because I was like trying to, you know, reactivate some of those neurons and see if I could just dredge some stuff up out of curiosity. And, you know, you've got all these like home recorded videos, you know, thousands of people around New York and Manhattan that day that were making home videos. I mean, obviously not on their cell phones at that point, but just making like home videos and stuff. And I can't tell you how many of them, you know, whether it was 10 seconds or 30 seconds or 10 minutes or whatever, all of these different videos of people, you know, because everybody was just huddling around staring at it. Like, every other video had somebody being like, that's going to collapse. And we're talking at like 9 in the morning, 9:30 in the morning. And it's because even then people were like, if that doesn't get abated, it's going to collapse. And
well, you saw the big hole in the side of the building, which was...
Yeah. And there's no way to sufficiently attack a fire. Like, I mean, it's just, you think about it, it's 8, 9 floors on fire. And like, again, it just goes uncontested. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they would have argument. Well, they do have arguments against it. But
you can't win. Yeah, you have to know like you're going into a losing battle, and I think that's maybe one of the biggest points from your book that I feel like a lot of people, if they're out there kind of listening to this and they've got someone in their life who's, you know, on the QAnon train or whatever train, is that like you're very focused on trying to suffuse compassion into the situation, which I think is very important. Like, you don't want to try to attack people. You don't want to try to come at them and like kill them with facts and logic or whatever. Your role is to just kind of like come down the mountain, provide information, go back up the mountain. Like, all you can do is like water on a rock, you know, like try your best, meet them at their level, be generous, be polite. And if they still don't listen to you that day or care, know that you did what you could and just kind of go on. And then maybe try it again. You know, I mean, this is the same thing I think like certain faith traditions and teachings try to teach us, and not enough people eat it there either. But that's, I think, a big part of your message in the book. It's like, just be as compassionate as possible, because these are still human beings, you know, like that's, I think, one of the issues we maybe run into with being afraid of conspiratorial minded people, is that it's like, you want to say, well, that's dangerous, we got to round them all up or whatever. And it's like, hey, they're humans. And you stress this a lot too in the book, where you're like initially trying to figure out what gives people that proclivity for conspiracy mindset, or why do they go into these directions. And once you kind of reach the conclusion where it's like, we don't really know, it could kind of happen to anyone, like that's one of those really sort of humbling moments where you're like, you know, it's very much like, if not for the grace of God, there go I. Like, you know, anyone could go down that. And once you realize that it's not that person's fault, or they're not stupid necessarily, because some of these people are incredibly intelligent, you know? And that's what, you know, disturbed me, especially recently with a lot of the like QAnon stuff. It's like, these are otherwise like upstanding, regular members of the community, very intelligent human beings, who then the next thing you know, they're like believing this other thing that's very fringe. And so I think the huge part of it is putting that humanity in the situation and knowing like, these are people, treat them like people. Like, yes, these ideas might be dangerous. Yes, you might not agree with them, but your role is to just try to constantly, you know, come back to them and be like, have you read this? Have you thought about this?
Yeah, that's great. And I obviously agree with all of that. And I think that's probably a good place to kind of wrap it up. So thank you very much. This has been like really interesting. I think your perspective is really, really great. Like it's kind of like shown things for me in a kind of a bit of a different light, just, you know, coming from this perspective of growing up in the conspiracy theories and having it being such a fundamental part of who you are that you almost like just didn't think about certain things for a while. And then how you finally, it's like, you know, you've got training now as a building inspector and I mean engineering, and I think that it's almost like you've had like these two parallel things and they kind of come together, and the one cancels out the other thing at some point. But it took, you know, this kind of trigger of you actually thinking about it again for it actually to be like, you know, purged a bit more from your system.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Alex.
Yeah.